So, shall we have the next chapter of The Mystery at the Manor? It's been so good to see so many of you enjoying, adults and children alike. That's been really great to see. And don't forget, if you've missed some of the earlier chapters, you can pick them up on the YouTube channel. Okay, so here we are. Chapter 4, The Old House. Beth waved goodbye to Pip as he settled down to fishing with Gramps for the afternoon. She was excited about at last seeing something of the lovely old house behind the fish pond. Nana had told her that once it had been filmed for TV when they were making a series about David Copperfield. Today she and Nana were going to meet the lady who owned it. "Come along, love," said Nana. "We don't want to keep Catherine waiting." As Beth was looking across the immaculate lawns towards the colourful flower beds near the house, she saw a slim young woman in a cool white dress and a large straw hat coming down to meet them. "Hello, my dears," she said. "I'm so glad you could come and help." She looked down at Beth and said, "Your grandma has offered to give me some advice about my kitchen garden. She knows so much more about plants and things than I do. Are you sure you're not going to be bored wandering around the grounds with us?" "Oh no," said Beth. "And anyway, Nana's been helping me to identify different flowers for my brownie badge when I get home." "So one day you'll be an expert too," said Catherine. "That's good. Well, come along and see." "Professionals have planted most of the gardens," Catherine continued, "but at the back of the house there used to be a walled garden. When the house was built in the 16th century, this walled kitchen garden was apparently filled with vegetables, herbs and spices. The guys have almost finished clearing it. It was full of all the rubbish from doing the house up. But at last it's almost ready for me to start planting." As she'd been talking, they had been walking on the sweeping path that led across the lawns towards the house itself. "It's a bit of a secret place, really," she added. "Not many people know about it." Keeping the house on their left-hand side, they walked past the front of the old red brick building, past the impressive timber doorway and the bright red and orange borders filled with many flowers that Beth didn't recognise, but among them were some tall white daisies and brilliant orange marigolds. They turned the corner of the house and were faced with a tall evergreen hedge. "Now this is the secret bit," said Catherine, almost in a hushed voice, as she walked calmly around the fourth tree, where the foliage had been cut back to reveal a small wooden door almost hidden behind the hedge. She lifted the latch and turned the heavy metal ring to open the door. She had to give it a good strong push until it swung back slowly on its hinges to reveal the garden beyond. Well, at least, Beth had been expecting a garden, but what she saw today was a large, square, empty area. At the far end there was a great pile of rubbish. It almost looked like a huge bonfire. There were rotting timbers, broken bricks and rubble heaped together, and the whole lot was topped off by the roots and branches of a large tree whose leaves were wilting in the sunshine. The rest of the square area was quite bare. It certainly didn't look like a garden. As if she could read Beth's mind, Catherine continued, "So this is it, or should I say, this is going to be it. Come in and see. It will be a garden one day soon, with a bit of hard work." The left-hand side of this garden-to-be was formed by the house itself. The tall hedge was behind them, and the other two sides had obviously once been completely walled in. Much of these walls had fallen down over the years, and the woodland that surrounded the house could easily be seen, crowding around the remains of the walls. Some of these ancient brickwork only stood about a metre or so high, but on the right-hand side, as Beth looked at it, there were hardly any stones standing on top of one another anymore. As Beth walked across the ground, she noticed that parts of it were rich brown soil, and other parts were lighter grey and stony. "You can just about make out the pattern of the old paths and beds," said Catherine, indicating the patterns Beth had noticed. "There used to be a small fish pond in the centre, but Greg said that it had become so broken down that they had to demolish it. It seems a shame, but perhaps one day we'll build it again and maybe have a fountain too. It's so quiet and peaceful round here, don't you think?" It certainly was. There was a stillness about this area, as though time stood still here. The hedge seemed to cut out even the small happy noises from the caravan site. The only sound Beth noticed was a soft scrunching that her feet made as she was walking around the paths, trying to imagine the kitchen garden as it would have been years ago. In the background she was aware that Nana and Catherine were discussing the various possibilities for the planting, but soon she began to move further away from them. She went to the edge of the area and looked over the broken wall. Catherine had told them that the elderberry tree that was now on the rubbish pile had been responsible for most of the damage on that side. Nana called it a vigorous grower, saying that elderberries had such huge roots that they could damage houses, not just garden walls. The few remaining bricks of the walls were covered almost entirely with brambles and nettles, and it was quite impassable. Beyond the remains of the wall she could see the sun on the grass over the other side, the shadows of the trees making dappled shapes on the ground. As she peered over the wall, she noticed lots of round shapes among the shadows and realised that they were fallen apples. She became aware of Nana's voice calling her. "Beth, did you hear what Catherine was saying?" "No, sorry, I was miles away," she admitted. "I was just telling you that the orchard has been a little neglected this year. We have been far too busy, and there are far too many apples for us to use. I was wondering if you might like to take some with you. There are some lovely eaters and some cooking apples too. It's a shame for them to go to waste, but I simply don't have enough time to collect and sort them this year. If you'd like to gather some, you're very welcome to." "Oh, yes, I'd like to do that," said Beth, glad of an excuse to go off and do a bit of exploring on her own. "You'll find an old basket over by the house door. Take as many as you like, dear," said Catherine. Beth ran back up the garden towards the back door of the house. Sure enough, there was an old basket there. It was very dusty and trimmed with a dirty old faded ribbon, but it would do perfectly well for collecting the fallen apples. She carried it back towards the area where Catherine and Nana were talking, and was wondering how to climb the broken down wall when Catherine explained. "If you go past the mound of rubbish, you'll see some honeysuckle and wild roses growing up the wall. Right in the middle of them you'll be able to squeeze through a small narrow iron gate. Put your hand through and lift up the latch. It will take you into the orchard. If you like plums, you'll find some just through the gate. They make beautiful jam. You could pop a few of them on the top of your apples when you come back. That way they won't get squashed by the heavier fruit." Beth made her way into the orchard and began collecting the windfalls. She had to examine them very closely, turning them over carefully and choosing only the best ones. Some of them were bruised and rotten, and a few even had worms inside them. Many of them had been partially eaten by birds and insects, but there were some very good ones among them. After she'd collected as many as she wanted, she sat down on a tree stump at the side of the path. She could hear the murmur of voices in the distance, but it was cool and quiet out here under the overhanging branches of the other trees. The path seemed to carry on, sloping downwards towards a hawthorn hedge that was covered in deep red berries. She could just make out a gap through the hedge into the wood beyond. She began to feel a little hungry and chose a lovely red eating apple, gave it a good rub on her t-shirt and crunched into it. It was juicy and sweet. She looked around her at the old gnarled trees that made up most of the orchard. There were some younger ones among them, but most looked as if they'd been there for years and years. She wondered how old they were, and again began to imagine what this place had looked like years before. She wondered what stories these trees might tell if they could. Who had chosen to build the house down here near the river? Had the people who lived here been happy or sad? She could almost feel that the old house was watching her. She glanced back toward the kitchen garden, but all she could see was Nana and Catherine deep in conversation still. At last she got up, threw the apple core over towards the hedge, to plant another apple tree, she thought, and began to wander back. She remembered what Catherine had said about gathering some plums. Retracing her steps towards the gate, she was expecting to see some juicy red plums like the ones her mum bought in the supermarket. But the only tree that could be a plum tree was covered with small dark fruit. They didn't look like the plums she knew. They were very dark, almost blue-black, and much smaller than she had been anticipating. She didn't fancy eating one, but decided to pick a few anyway. Perhaps they would be all right when they were cooked, and Catherine said they made good jam. She wondered if Nana would show her how to make some. Pip and Gramps were just packing up as Beth and Nana walked down the drive towards the pond. As they all wandered back to the caravan, they chattered about their afternoons. Pip told of his success at fishing, and Beth showed them her collection of fruit. Nana and Gramps began to say that they would have to go shopping the next day, and then they broke out laughing at the expressions on the children's faces. "Now then, there's no need to look so glum," said Gramps. "I don't see any reason why we should be accompanied by two unwilling shoppers, do you, Nana?" "Well, I don't know," she replied. "If they don't come into Chelmsford with us, they might get bored here on their own." "No, we won't," said Pip. "Could we really stay?" asked Beth in surprise. "Provided you keep to the rules like you have been up to now, I don't see why not," said Nana. "You've proved that you are trustworthy," added Gramps. "If you'd rather have the afternoon on your own, that's fine with us." Pip was quite quiet on the rest of the way back, wondering what they would do. He'd enjoyed that day's fishing, but thought that Beth might not be too keen on doing the same tomorrow. Then he thought that they could spend the afternoon with Jack. He would be bound to come up with some good ideas. After tea that evening, Pip met Jack at the shower block and arranged to meet him the next day at the top field as soon as their grandparents left. That night, as they were listening to another story, Pip looked even less interested than before. Beth had liked the look of a picture of an angel with wings that seemed to flutter above the page, but Pip pretended not to be listening at all until he said derisively, "A donkey talking? You must be joking." "But the man wouldn't listen to the angel," said Beth defensively. "Well, I'm still not convinced that a donkey spoke," said Pip. "Shall I finish the story?" asked Nana. "Oh, yes, please," said Beth. Pip just looked the other way, but Nana smiled to herself. She wasn't fooled. So that's a couple of times now that I've mentioned some Bible stories, just hinted at them in my story. And here's a picture that comes from the very back of the book, where it tells you how to find these stories in case you want to find out, really, was there a donkey talking? Really, were there some black birds and a queen who died like that? Well, if you want to find those, I suggest that you find a modern translation of the Bible, and there is where to find them, those stories. And you'll find in the rest of the book that there are some other stories too. Most of them are stories which perhaps you haven't heard before. Some of them I think you will recognise. Okay, enjoy.